This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello everyone. For those of you who haven't watched since the beginning of the summit, I'm Clothilde Goujard and I'm a tech reporter here at Politico. I'm really happy to bring you this discussion today about the algorithms behind AI. We'll talk about how transparent and accountable algorithms need to be and why that matters. To debate today, let me introduce our guests. We have a leading AI researcher, Nigel Shadbolt, who's the principal of Jesus College and a professor of computing science at the University of Oxford. Nigel is also the co-founder and executive chair of the Open Data Institute, a nonprofit working with companies and governments on open and trustworthy data infrastructure. Next, we have Keith Sonderling, who was supposed to be with us today, but wasn't able to come. Keith is a commissioner at the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a regulator enforcing federal laws in the US against workplace discrimination. As such, Keith is one of the 5 officials who's developing and approving the Commission's policies, issuing charges of discrimination, and authorizing the filing of lawsuits. And last but not least, we have here with us Sam Cannicott, the Deputy Director at the Centre for Data, Ethics and Innovation, a British government expert body advising ministries and working on data and AI. The organization works on developing roadmaps on things like certifications and impact assessments for AI systems, and also helps public sectors like police forces, the Ministry of Defense, local authorities, and also the Department of Education develop and use data-driven technology responsibly. We've seen great interest in lots of capitals around the world, from Brussels to London, Washington, and Beijing, to better understand and grapple with the algorithms behind artificial intelligence. And the idea here is to lay out rules and safeguards for how these algorithms, powered by billions and billions of data points, can be used for anything from self-driving cars to automated hiring and social benefits tools, or just medical diagnosis and therapy chatbots. We'll start with Nigel. Nigel, you're an academic leading this Open Data Institute, which works with governments on trustworthy data. What are the main misunderstandings that you see when you advise policymakers trying to better create rules to oversee AI systems and to ensure the use of responsible algorithms?
Well, yes, thank you. It's not so much about misunderstandings as just the kind of rate of change. In some sense, these challenges aren't entirely new. We've had algorithms making decisions in credit scoring companies for decades. And so we're familiar with some of the challenges about how fair, explicable, transparent those decisions are, the data they draw on to make those decisions. But of course, it's the rapid rate of change in AI and the technological breadth and pervasive nature of these systems that's so very different today. So for ministers and decision and policymakers in government and in other agencies, the challenge is just to have a sense of what is so different about the techniques and methods. And it's, as you've indicated, it's about scale. All of these AI algorithms are powered by data. So we do need to attend to the fundamental question of how representative and reasonable and fair the data is, how robust systems are that are trained on one data set when they're transferred into another context. In AI, we call this the challenge of distribution shift. How are we going to be assured that those outcomes are fair in a new context or generalized? And then, of course, there's the nature of the algorithms themselves. And too often, modern machine learning, for example, one of the new powerful sets of methods available, is very opaque. It's very complex, and it can appear like a black box. And of course, the challenge there is to make the decision making, render it more explicit, help an explanation, and really to kind of demystify, in some sense, for the policymakers what the actual challenge is. And really, those are some of the challenges we face: explaining the nature of the data space and the fundamental features of this new breed of algorithms.
Keith, we're seeing a big push to ensure algorithms are transparent and accessible. Here in Brussels, for example, we have the Digital Services Act that is nearing its finalization. And so with this, regulators, for example, could be able to go and look at big social media's algorithms to see if they're complying with the law. So how important is it to mandate that companies, but also public administrations, are transparent with the algorithms they're building or that they're using?
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm delighted to participate online. And yes, from my perspective, in my regulatory body, as you said, we're the premier civil rights agency in the United States. Our mission is to prevent and remedy unlawful employment discrimination and advance equal opportunity in the workplace. So although our laws are from the 1960s, they apply equally to decisions employers are making using data now with algorithms as they did relying on HR professionals in the past. So to your question about, from a regulator's perspective, how do we understand the transparency and how important is that for us? And I've argued it is very important, and we want systems to be designed in a way that they can be understood, especially when you're making decisions based upon someone's livelihood and their ability to enter in the workplace. But at the end of the day, as a civil law enforcement agency, we're going to look at the results. We're going to look at what decision the algorithm made. And if there's bias and if there's discrimination, the results are going to show that. And how we got there, it's either going to be based in the AI context in HR, based upon a discriminatory data set, which we'll give examples of, or an algorithm that was used the wrong way to discriminate. But there's been such a push for what is that algorithm? How do we see that? And how do we get that code? And from my perspective now of how we regulate HR decisions, we haven't been able to get the black box, so to say, of what is in an HR professional's mind when they discriminate, when they make an employment decision. But with AI, we can at least now have more neutral data points that we can look at and to see how did we get here and how did we get to that result. So there's so many people pushing for that transparency and all that's important. But from a practical sense, from right now, we're looking at the results.
Sam, would you tend to agree with what Keith just said? What are the challenges for you in making algorithms transparent?
Yeah, I agree with Keith. The outcome is obviously what's important. I think the important thing, though, when we think about transparency, as Keith said, it doesn't solve all the challenges, but it's not a silver bullet. But it is something that we know from the work my centre's done in engaging with people and running focus groups, that transparency is something that people often call on and say they want. And transparency for an individual citizen is very different to what transparency might mean to those who are sort of developing and practitioners of these tools. But there's an important transparency is important because of how it relates to public trust, but it's not straightforward. And sort of one of the things we do in the centre I work at is think about the practical application of some of these principles. So what does sort of the practical application of transparency look like? And over the last 6 months or so, we've developed a public sector algorithmic transparency standard, which we've worked with the Cabinet Office in the UK, where public sector bodies using algorithmic tools can use this standard and publish information about the algorithms they're using. And the aim of that is more sort of a reporting standard rather than a technical standard, but it does enable organizations to set out in a consistent way what they're using the algorithm for, what sort of data it uses. And then more importantly, I think, is how that algorithm interacts with the wider decision-making process. So often algorithms aren't used as standalone things to make decisions, they're part of a wider sort of governance system. And this transparency standard helps organizations set out how that works. So I think there's a role for sort of mechanisms like that to address transparency, but more fundamentally is sort of thinking about how do we develop and innovate in a way that carries and drives public trust.
And I remember when we talked previously, you'd mentioned that you have to be aware, there needs to be genuine transparency and not some sort of marketing exercise to try to pretend.
Yeah, I think in the space, explainability and transparency are often the things that people reach to as though it's going to solve all the problems. And it's such a, as Nigel was saying, we're talking about really complex tools in this space, and explainability is difficult. And I think there's a risk if we see it as an easy solution, that you'll get explainability that actually is trying to simplify something that is very complex. So they have an important role to play, but they're not going to solve all the challenges. And I guess the challenge we need to think about is what does meaningful explainability look like, and how do we support organizations to work transparently and in an explainable way, but in a way that is also actually useful and helps build trust rather than undermines trust if it just becomes a sort of, as you say, a marketing exercise.
Mm-hmm. Nigel, there has been quite a lot of research on how algorithms can be discriminatory, obviously, depending on which data sets they're built. How do you make sure that these problematic biases can be avoided, or at least spotted and fixed as soon as possible before they harm people?
Well, you need to have a really fundamental understanding of the types of bias that any data set might contain. So you're looking to stress test the features of the data set, everything from its size, the quality, the extent to which the features that are going to be important in the output decisions are represented. We've seen lots of examples, everything from facial discrimination to systems that can identify potential lesions on your skin that have been trained on data sets that haven't transferred well into other contexts, into other ethnicities, into other populations. So we're kind of familiar with what the checklist might look like to take us through the kind of robust interrogation of whether data is likely to be fit for purpose. But there will be edge cases, and we constantly need to be kind of challenging the system. As both, as we just heard from our other panelists, the key is around the outputs. I mean, ultimately, you're looking to see whether or not the outcomes are unfair, discriminatory in some sense. And that is also important, that you've got to be able to hold a benchmark against what effective performance looks like. And there will always be this interesting question about whether we are holding our algorithms to much higher standards than human expert performance, and what that even means, and whether a fact that we can ever affect perfect. Now, what are the error bars on natural decision making? There's something in there that we need to understand, and I think that's where the EU work around tiered risk assessment is really quite helpful. And we know there are some conditions on which this will be really important. And just a final point on explanation. People seek explanations from systems for all sorts of different purposes. And I think that when we look at explanations, there isn't any particular canonical style of explanation that will work. For some people, they want to know what the parameters in the decision-making were that affected their case. For other people, it's how do they stack up against other decisions that the system is making for other individuals? There are a whole range of different forms of explanation that people, institutions, organizations, individuals find acceptable. And so this is a very active area of work. It's not just trying to probe the internals of the algorithm to understand what's being transformed. It's also what it is that makes sense for people who are trying to make judgments about how effective the decision-making is.
Talking about making sense for people, for regular people, I guess, Keith, we're seeing AI increasingly used in the field of HR. How do regulators ensure that discriminatory algorithms, victims of these algorithms, can get redressed? What are you seeing in your field in the US at the moment?
Yeah, whether you're aware of it or not, AI is being used in every stage of the job life cycle. It does everything from write job descriptions, screen resumes, it chats with applicants, it conducts job interviews, it assesses workers, and nowadays, if an employee falls short of expectations, it will just tell them they're fired. So it is widely in the HR space, which is significant because this is an area that was really subject to human bias, which is one of the reasons my agency exists. And let me give you an example of that. And I want to follow up on the discussion we just had on the data set. That's why it's attractive to employers in the HR space. AI's predictions about applicants, it's only as sound as the data on which the algorithms are relying, because AI has no motives or intentions of its own, unlike people. AI has algorithms that make it help correlate that data. And according to industry experts in the HR space, this is one of the things that makes it so attractive to employers. Its reliance on hard data but creates the potential to eliminate discrimination by removing human bias from the decision-making process. And when it is designed in a clear and explainable way, it eliminates one of the biggest challenges to effective human resource management. That is the capriciousness of human taste, human bias, all these elements we were never able to see before. But the objective nature of algorithm decision-making can result in this bias on the user. That's an over-reliance, if not blind trust, that the AI is always going to get it right, because inaccurate, incomplete, or unrepresented data will only amplify rather than minimize bias in decision-making. And let me give you an example in the HR space. So, there's so many vendors out there that will help sort resumes that you can go to and say, here are my 10 best salespeople. Go find me more of them. And it will use machine learning to find patterns in those best applicants. And the most infamous example from the United States is one company said, here are my best workers, go find me more of them. And the algorithm said the most likely indicators of success at this particular company was being named Jared and having played lacrosse. And in lacrosse in the United States is considered a very wealthy white sport to play. So, that is only because it was a function of what the data was in that data set, but it can discriminate. And there's no defense saying that the algorithm made the decision, I'm not liable for the discrimination. The employer is liable for discrimination. So much of it is based upon that data set, and it's just being used at all aspects of the employment relationship.
Sam, you and your center advise police forces and the Ministry of Defense and Department of Education in deploying responsible AI. We've seen failures in the use of algorithms in a lot of different contexts in the UK and in lots of Western countries. Just a bit less than 2 years ago, for example, in the UK, there's an algorithm that wrongly determined the grades of British students, particularly high achievers in Free State schools. And the situation provoked outrage because some of the kids couldn't go to the universities they wanted to go to. So when you advise policymakers who are building these algorithms and thinking about how they could use them, what do you try to tell them? What do you try to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I guess there's a risk that algorithms become seen as these sort of evil things that that sort of set apart from everything else. So one of the starting points in all this is, as I said earlier, it's back to sort of public trust and what is publicly acceptable. And, as we were just hearing, there are human biases in lots of these high stakes decision-making processes, and there may be opportunities for using data and AI to address some of that. But fundamental to that is carrying the public with you and carrying citizen trust with you. So one of the things we've been doing and working with teams on, for example, you mentioned work in policing, but we've also been doing some work, as I said, on public sector transparency, but also work on the uses of AI in recruitment, is actually going and engaging with people and understanding their expectations. So what do they want to see if data is being used to make decisions? What does the sort of governance framework look like? How do you set out how data is being used? What are the mechanisms for appeal and that sort of thing? So it's not just seeing the algorithm as a standalone tool. It's more wider than that, and setting out how it fits in the wider decision-making process. But also always thinking about what is publicly acceptable in this space, and not just starting with the data, but actually starting with the people and what their expectations are.
And so when you ask people, what do they tell you?
So often it is around understanding how data is. So there is that transparency element, but I think the important point as well is also how that decision fits in with wider human decision making. So, you know, what fundamentally, where does a human make a decision versus a computer making a decision? And often there's a misunderstanding that machines are just making these decisions by themselves. There's often a more complex process than that. So setting that out and making sure that is clearly understood for people, and that they can get the information they want about how data is used. And then, you know, coupled with that is then, do we have the right processes in place for more technical scrutiny of these things? So when we're working, for example, with some of the work we've been doing with police forces, but other organisations as well, is understanding what mechanisms they have for getting challenged. So is it opening up their algorithm to academic experts? Is it establishing sort of internal ethics panels to really scrutinise and question these things? How are these things being trialed before being rolled out? And then I think the other thing that's also important is the ongoing and monitoring and evaluation of these things, because what we don't know is if you launch something, sort of the wider impact that might have on your decision-making system, and is that being monitored and reviewed, both to see what sort of positive impact it's having, but also just monitoring in case it's having any sort of negative implications as well.
Nigel, do you believe that sometimes there's this naive sense from policymakers, lawmakers, or just regular people that you know, algorithms can solve many problems we have? I'm thinking, for example, of the use of emotion recognition tools to try to figure out if a migrant or someone is lying. Does that really work? Is there some sense that algorithms and technology is going to solve everything?
Well, that, of course, is this notion that this latest technology is the silver bullet is too easy to reach for very often. I mean, in the press of events, with the sheer amount and pace of decisions that have to be taken, you can see why people will reach for these automated methods. I think we've heard from colleagues on the panel, from Sam, that the sense of augmenting these algorithmic decision makings with appeals to human decision making, that humans in the loop are really crucially important. I think that it's always the case that we have, whether it's in a judicial context or a context of consumer-based intention to buy, the kinds of HR contexts we heard from Keith, it seems to me that there are all sorts of reasons why we will always come back to a recognition that the human social animal, so to say, sees things in a much broader context, and that needs to be factored in whenever you're looking to deploy technology. When you take humans out the loop, wherever that loop is, at oversight, at governance, on review and test of the design of the algorithms, you're in danger of this kind of rather fragile technological determinism, yes.
Keith, here in Brussels, lawmakers are currently working on the EU's AI Act, and this law could set more obligations, some bans as well, and some rules for the quality of the data sets and documentation and human overview. How are you looking as an American regulator at the EU's work on this bill, and how could this have an impact on companies in the US and your work in general?
Yeah, I'm looking at it very closely because this bill essentially discusses that everything in my space is high risk and subject to those robust reporting requirements. And I think that's really important to look at from our perspective, because in the United States, you don't see one legislative proposal like you have in the EU that's really covering all the technologies, that's labeling the different technologies between risk levels, and it's actually putting on additional requirements. What you're seeing here in the United States is a patchwork of regulatory frameworks, both on the executive branch and in states and local governments, specific to the exact area where each regulator has to regulate. So at least at the national level, though, we're not seeing much from Congress. There was the Algorithmic Accountability Act that was reproposed this year, but that deals more with the Federal Trade Commission and some of the advertising side of it, not as much as the specific bias in the workplace that I have to deal with. But there was some executive orders at the end of 2019 and 2020 that really laid out the framework for artificial intelligence for the American government's use on it. And it discussed about how we have an obligation to develop and apply AI in a manner consistent with civil liberties, privacy, and American values. And then the second executive order created through the National Artificial Intelligence Act, which put some executive branch an AI initiative office into place. So from the executive branch, you're seeing my agency has an initiative, which I'll discuss. The Federal Trade Commission has talked about it. The FDA has talked about it. Department of Defense has talked about it. So it's not as succinct as in EU, where there's one proposal really covering all the different types of uses. In the United States, it's very much each agency is looking at their specific use. But the issue here in the United States, and I'm going to go back to the area I regulate, which is bias and discrimination in employment, you're starting to see states take the lead in absence of this federal framework. So the state of Illinois passed a law regarding facial recognition use for applicants. The city of New York passed a bill that will go into effect in January 2023 relating to the use of automated decision tools in employment, talking about some of those bias and audit requirements, talking about the transparency and how employees know they're being subject to that tool, and requiring employers to publicly post results of a bias audit on their website. So the framework in the United States right now, it is really very fractured in the sense where you have state and local governments moving forward. You have various different federal agencies moving forward on what they specialize, but you don't have that national framework, unlike the EU, which I'm studying very closely. I think the EU Artificial Intelligence Act does a great job in the sense where it, takes the area I regulate and designates it, and then gives additional requirements in addition to those vendor liabilities. So it's something I know all of us here in the United States are studying very closely.
Sam, in the UK, there's been a softer regulatory approach. There's been the national strategy that was released in the fall, and now the UK is working towards a white paper. What can we expect from this white paper, and what sort of efforts are we seeing done in this regulatory space in the UK?
You have to wait for the white paper. So we published a national data strategy last year, which sort of sets out our ambition, and then we'll be publishing the AI white paper later this year. And I guess one of the things on that is looking at what does the existing regulatory regime look like, and how can it be improved? And by improved, meaning are there unnecessary burdens that are stopping responsible innovation, but also can it be strengthened in ways that to address potential harms? But I think alongside that approach, one of the things we're also looking at is what can be done outside of regulations. So the centre that I lead has a program on AI assurance, which is looking at how do you support a sort of AI assurance ecosystem so that those purchasing or wanting to deploy algorithmic or AI technologies sort of know that they will do what they say on the tin. So and how do you sort of build confidence in this space? So that covers a suite of things. From one area that I think is really interesting is the role of standards in this space. How can you develop standards? And we're looking at how we are working with industry and others to think about where could standards be developed that will help build trust in this space. And then there's things like other tools like AI impact assessments, that sort of thing, that can all be used as a way of sort of building trust outside of regulation, but are actually ways of sort of strengthening the governance of the system, I guess, and giving people the confidence they need to develop and deploy technologies.
So you're not looking at setting some specific rules as of now?
So the work is ongoing into sort of developing that AI white paper. And the work that we do in the centre, of course, is when we're sort of working on more practical problems, we can draw insights into that and feed that into the policy team. So we're sort of the bridge between those sort of coming up against some of these really tricky issues and working closely with the policy team back in government who are working on these issues in more detail.
Right. We have a question from someone who's watching, Rebecca Anselmetti, to Nigel. She says, you spoke about how to address bias and the need to set benchmark for testing algorithms' accuracy and transparency. Are technical consensus standards being developed by SDOs something that is being looked at in this space for setting such benchmark on algorithmic bias?
Yeah, and I think It is. It's sector specific. The work on this looks at what benchmark distributions might look like in terms of output classes and input classes, types of representation. So yes, there is work that is ongoing. There's a lot more that's required. I think to the point around data assurance, we definitely do need much more work to establish what are the operational limits, the data characteristics that we're looking for in areas that often will have very different sorts of characteristics, whether you're working in transportation on the one hand, justice, HR decisions, and so on.
Keith, is that something you're also looking at this or looking forward to, these insurances?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, from our perspective, we need to give employees information about applicants, information about how these AI systems are being used in employment, whether it's for job promotion or getting the job. And then from employers, what, you know, we keep talking about bias, we keep talking about transparency and audits. What are we going to do from our perspective to make sure that companies who are buying these AI systems have the tools they need to ask the vendors very specific questions about the sort of transparency we've been discussing and the audit framework that the vendor is going to do for them, or it allows the employer or a company, once they buy it, to institute their own audit. And then once the employer buys it themselves, how do you institute it in a way that doesn't discriminate? How do you institute it in a way where you can test the data sets, where you test the algorithm before ever letting it make a decision based upon somebody's livelihood? So I think as regulators, that's really on us to make that very clear and practical guidance about not only the transparency, but what you do while, before, during, and after implementing these. And what does that framework look like? And that's something I hope to achieve through technical assistance or guidance document from our commission related to our very specific use in human resources.
Nigel, what are you expecting from the EU's, are you watching the EU's AI Act, and what are you expecting from it?
I think we've touched on a very interesting challenge, I think, which is a presumption within the EU Act that there is a omnibus approach here, that in some sense we can produce normative guidance. And of course, within the common law framework, it's very much more harms based. You know, show us the harm, and then one responds in that context. I'm really looking forward to the fact that what has happened, of course, it's brought huge attention onto the kind of questions we've been discussing today, the consequential impact of not doing these surveys and reviews really materially focus people's attention. So what I like is the fact that it's making people pay attention. It's making people think at the design level, deployment level, what just are the intrinsic challenges. And I think the one other thing to be aware of is that the speed of advance here. There is a concern that new sorts of data concentration are occurring, the production of so-called foundation models in machine learning, which only relatively few companies are able to assemble and manage, and which are providing the core engines for many decision makings across many sectors. So there will be, I think, a need to go back and look at issues that relate as much to competition and fair access to very, very large training sets, which are powering some modern models. And I think that we do need to think about how regulation doesn't apply to the algorithms. It is these massive sets of data that are used in support of the algorithms that are going to be, I think, on people's minds.
We've reached the end of our panel. I want to thank our panelists today, Nigel Shadbolt, Keith Sonderling, and Sam Cannicott. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the algorithms behind AI. If you're online, please stay connected. And if you're here with us, please stay seated for our next session on Europe's role in AI diplomacy with my colleague, Mark Scott.